Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hi everyone and welcome to LawPod. I'm Rachel Killean, a lecturer in the School of Law, and I'm joined today by Dr. Peter Manning, who is a lecturer in sociology at the University of Bath, where he specialises in human rights, transitional justice and memory studies. His research explores connections between human rights, transitional justice and memory, and his book, Transitional Justice and Memory in Cambodia, considers the different ways that memory is implicated in the ongoing prosecutions at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Hi Pete.
Hi, thank you for having me.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. So we're here today to discuss what sociology can bring to the study of human rights and transitional justice. Do you want to maybe start by telling us what is meant by a sociology of human rights?
Yeah, it's a really big question, and I suppose you could do a really sort of short answer, which I suppose I'll try to first. Which is that sociologists are broadly interested, right, in your relationships that people have with institutions, with other people, with political authorities, how they identify themselves, how other people identify them, questions of sort of inequalities in those relationships, and therefore sort of questions of like politics and power as well, right? So those are the things that sort of really, animate the discipline, I suppose. And in that sense, when you think about what human rights are, as a set of sort of claims, I suppose, first and foremost, to be protected from abuses or, the vagaries of nasty governments or whatever else, or as a sort of language for making those claims, or as a set of sort of regulatory principles for the behaviour of governments, then of course sociologists can be interested in it, right? These are sort of prime objects of sociological analysis as such. The slightly longer version of that story, I suppose, is that, it's really not until the last 30 years or so that sociologists have sort of come to this party. And certainly the way that sociology in at least the last 2 decades has really tried to kind of self-identify and carve out its own disciplinary space, or subdisciplinary space as a field, or as a sociology of human rights, a field of the sociology of human rights. That's much more recent, I suppose, and that's tied, I think, at least to, a disciplinary history where I think, as the canon, I suppose, is sort of explained, you go back to the beginning of sociology, your undergrad students that are doing criminology will be familiar with, I don't know, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, or whatever else, right? And these people weren't interested in human rights. They couldn't be interested in human rights, because for Marx, they were obviously, distractions from the real sort of cleavages and oppressions that were going on in the day. For Weber, well, we wouldn't be interested in kind of normative rights claims, or Durkheim, the same thing. So there's that sort of empiricism, I suppose, and positivism that was limiting engagements with ideas about rights in the first place at the beginning of the discipline. And that's funny, right? Because that sort of shapes what sociology looks like from there. It's interested first and foremost in sort of nation states as synonymous with society. So there's a sort of methodological nationalism going on in the discipline, and that attenuates our ability to think about human rights. And I suppose as well, the sort of central concerns following from that within sociology have always been about questions of, say, stratification or identity, right? And the irony about all of that is that those are always human rights issues, when you're thinking about kind of the big things that have driven sociology since, the origin story, whether you're talking from, feminist sociologists or sociologists of race and ethnicity, all of these things are actually, human rights concerns.
Wow, thank you. That was comprehensive. So what then would a sociological approach to human rights give to law students, or why should law students be interested in a sociological approach to human rights?
Well, I think the thing is, I'm a bit aware here that I don't want to sort of set law up, or I don't want to caricature or sort of straw man law as a discipline, right? And there's plenty of people here doing brilliant work, from a sort of socio-legal studies background or, critical legal theory or whatever else, right? And that will draw in very interesting sort of interdisciplinary ways across sociology. But I think one thing that sociology does do quite well is help sort of think beyond legalism a little bit, right? And if I can kind of use legalism as the sort of the placeholder, I suppose, that I'd be not quite attacking, but I suppose querying, right? That's where sociology, I think, is most useful, because first and foremost, what's it interested in? It's interested in context, it's interested in history, and it's interested in power, right? And these are questions that legalist tendency tends to suppress, at least a little bit.
What do you mean by legalism?
Legalism, well, I mean, I think what I'm getting at is that, you need more than law to understand law, right? Legalism tends to be, it's a tendency that's quite self-referential, right? And, let's say I'm delivering my first sort of undergraduate lecture of the year, right? A human rights course, the first thing I'll do is ask the students, I don't know, what are human rights, or give me an example of a human right. And someone will say something like, I don't know, the right to free expression or whatever, basic sort of civic and political right. Or they might say, I don't know, economic and social and cultural right, whether it's like shelter or housing or whatever else, And then I'll say, well, where do these things come from? And they'll say that, I don't know, because the UN said so, or, or because it's just moral, right? Or, it could be something else, right? Because it's politically important, And at that point, what you're doing immediately is starting to disentangle the fact that human rights aren't just in sort of treaties and covenants, right? So we've got to think about this. Even just in those examples there, you can think there's a kind of philosophical lineage here. There's a history that you trace back to the Enlightenment in terms of human rights that people have to be sort of on board with. There's a whole set of sort of institutional assemblages and configurations, whether you're talking about the sort of big organisations, right, or the sort of very mobile sort of international NGOs, or all the sort of more domesticated or domiciled NGO groups, and then activist communities, and in that respect, you're already starting to think about human rights not just as something that exists within the black letter, I suppose, but it's something that's practically used, practically sort of worked with, and what I'm getting at is that what I try to encourage students to think about is that these ideas, whether you're talking about them in their most general form, right? In terms of sort of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or whether you're talking about how human rights are mobilised in any given case or instance, there's a sort of contingency that we've got to recognise. They don't have to look the way they do, and so in that respect, I think you're encouraging students to really look at this topic as something that's sort of living and breathing, and it's not exogenous to the social, but actually constituted by the social, so to speak.
And say our undergrads came along and you had to give one lecture on what sociology brought to human rights. What would the kind of main theoretical contributions be, do you think? Well,
I think, there's a few. So this is where things get a bit tricky, I suppose, because I think within, this subdisciplinary space, right, that, we might call the sociology of human rights, and we're... To be completely candid, where I think we're volunteering ourselves for a sort of coherence that that we don't necessarily have to sort of wear as a badge of pride. I think actually there's a division of labour that's quite important in all of this, right? I mean, in terms of what sociology does with human rights, you could be talking about questions of perpetration, right? You could go back to sort of the Milgram tests. You could be talking about Bauman, rereading the Holocaust. You could be talking about a lot of the work that goes on in sort of perpetrator research, right? About social context and how that informs the perpetration of human rights abuse. That's the sort of thing that could go into a lecture. Sociologists have had a crack at trying to explain or offer sort of versions of, foundationalist theories of what a human right might be, right, or where human rights come from. So if you put aside all the sort of, Enlightenment philosophy, right, we're not talking sort of Kant and Locke and whoever else, right? Sociologists have had a go at this as well. Brian Turner came up with a theory of human rights, based on this empirical idea that because we're all kind of precarious and fragile, as a sort of universal common experience, you can sort of derive, the need for human rights on that basis. Now, I think probably what I would want to do, right, having kind of, offered those two sort of different forms of sociological sort of contribution to discussions about human rights or understandings of human rights, is say that I think the most important stuff that's going on, at least at the moment, is based on a more sort of constructionist reading of human rights, and it's more interested in that question of contingency, and particularly the relationship between contingency and power. And so in that respect, a lot of the stuff I teach would be, maybe in dialogue about the Genocide Convention, for example, it's shaping, it's framing, who's left out, who's included, who's not, the sorts of groups, for example, that just neglected, the implications of that, and also the sort of framing of questions of intent and, why these things matter, what sort of disciplinary sort of authority actually kind of constitutes the wording of those particular documents, right? So you can run exercises like that.
How would you define human rights?
How would I define human rights?
Yeah.
I wouldn't. I mean, this is it. My whole take in the work that I do is to sort of follow, how human rights are made meaningful in context, right? In that respect, I mean, it's a bit of a cop out, right? I suppose, in the sense of kind of doing the foundationalist work. But my argument is that, well, that's not my task. My task is to look at how people are implementing and using and making human rights arguments meaningful in different contexts and with what effect, right? And by doing that, I think that's when you can ask questions of, well, how this isn't inevitable. How could this be better? How could this be more transformative, right?
Yeah. So then, if we think about that, how do you translate that kind of inquiry into something that's practically useful, or that helps us, better combat state violence or oppression?
I think the thing to remember is that what you've got is a set of sociological critiques that might say, for example, human rights are very Eurocentric, right? Or human rights lend themselves to forms of imperialism, right? Or can constitute forms of sort of imperialism. When Rumsfeld, for example, right, justifies the war in Iraq as a war in the name of human rights back in 2002, right, imposing sort of human rights and democracy from beyond, right? And you recognise that human rights can have sort of effects that are contradictory to its sort of spirit and ethos, right? And that's an argument that you trace right back to sort of the origin story of human rights. That's perpetual peace and Kant and all the arguments about cosmopolitanism and whatever else. I think the point I'm making is that sort of critique is useful in and of its own right, first and foremost, right? And in terms of the way some sociological theorists of human rights approach this, they would say that's an important step, first and foremost. I think the second point is that what you see is the sort of academic writing coming out of not necessarily that might maybe informed by those two kinds of critique, but not necessarily with such a hostility towards the sort of human rights project in its sort of mainstream, but at least asking more of what it can deliver. And so I think we've got examples in front of us, right? In your book, one of the things that this is victims trustee international criminal law, right? You're talking about what victim participation can offer at the tribunal in Cambodia, and you're basically asking it to sort of deliver more, and that's predicated on an argument that sort of recognises the contingency of that mechanism and of the law that underpinned it as it came into existence, right? So in that sense, I bracket you in that sort of second category. As somebody who's not necessarily sort of, hostile to the Human Rights Project, but is certainly, I would say cautiously critical but sympathetic to these things, but at least informed by that sort of spirit of critique, right? And then on that basis, that can inform engagements with activists, engagements with practitioners, engagements with people who are responsible for creating and maintaining and reproducing these sorts of legal instruments. So.
And how does your background in this area then influence your own work?
You go way back, because my sort of story starts with all of this stuff, like as a wet behind the ear sort of, backpacker back in Cambodia. We're talking a long time ago, this sort of, white boys Orientalist fantasy, right? Where you kind of think about Cambodia as this sort of, slightly wild west place. The war had just ended, and I was supposed to sort of travel all around Southeast Asia, and all of that's really problematic. And I kind of have been trying to sort of write against that a little bit, I think, in the work that I've done since then. But that experience certainly, I ended up working over there basically for a year, and I was really struck actually by the dissonances between that sort of language, right, that we encounter all the time, right, in the press, and a lot of the coverage of Cambodia is this sort of corrupt, backwater that is violent and dangerous and. And is sort of politically dysfunctional, right? And the culture is absolutely amnesiac because the state tells everybody not to remember anything, right? That sort of, newspaper narrative you get quite often, and that's really long-standing. That's a sort of very well-rehearsed trope that's sort of been wheeled out to describe what's gone on in Cambodia for years. You get that almost in. This is a point that I think Rachel Hughes has made actually in some of her writing about the tribunal, certainly. You get that almost in the Lonely Planet guides, but also, as much as the sort of, agonised London Review of Books type sort of commentary on this sort of thing. But at least in that year, I was struck by the fact that, people were saying, okay, nobody talks about this, nobody remembers what happened there, this genocide in 1975, 79. This experience where 1.7 million people have died, right? Okay, so, at that time it was, 30 years afterwards, there or thereabouts. And actually people were talking about it, right? But they just weren't talking about it in the ways that we were equipped to sort of recognise. It's not like there was, public discussion about it. It wasn't on the school curriculum at that time. It is now. But back then, certainly, I can remember kind of friends with their kids, and they'd be saying, if you don't eat up all your rice, the Pol Pots will come and get you, that sort of thing. And so actually, this idea of sort of amnesia or, a pathology of memory, right, was I found problematic, and even if I didn't sort of, clock it straight away, that informed certainly kind of, how I ended up writing like an undergrad dissertation and a master's dissertation, and then deciding to write a PhD about this, what I thought would be a sort of, initially, a sort of sociological account of, the tribunal as a mechanism that was supposed to sort of work in the name of reconciliation, right? Because the whole idea, underpinning the tribunal was that it was prosecuting only a handful of senior leaders, and on that basis there's a sort of de facto amnesty for lots of lower level Khmer Rouge, right? And if you've got this tribunal that's sort of writing a particular history in a particular way, and it's trying to sort of discipline memory in a particular way, if you've got sort of localized divergent memories that kind of think about things or remember things or reproduce memory in different ways, well, maybe that has implications for how we think about people reconcile around shared accounts of the past, right? That was the sort of question I embarked with. I mean, it's obviously like way more complicated than that. That was sort of for any sort of PhD student that's listening, that's when your sort of research question starts, and then actually just
what did
get
you
out
end
into
up
the field
finding?
and it sort of blows up, and that's sort of the fun part. So
what did you end up finding?
Well, I think the first thing is that this is really that question of the intersection of human rights, transitional justice, and memory studies, right? Certainly, just as a very, very, very brief sort of pressing, I suppose, memory studies is this sort of, interdisciplinary space itself, right? Which, again, kind of wants to have a coherence when it's got a hell of a lot going on and doesn't necessarily have to sort of, I think, spell out its own coherences in the way that it wants to. Anyway, it's interested in the first place, right, about how groups, come to remember shared experiences or, constitute themselves, identify themselves as groups as such on the basis of kind of collective memories, right? That was kind of the Halbach's take, and then memory studies sort of grew up, responding provocatively to sort of the problems with that sort of set of questions. Anyway, I mean, so you can think straight away that there's a relationship then between kind of how groups remember the past, and then how tribunals sort of, didactic mechanisms as much as sort of, delivering, retributive verdicts, right, or punishment, or just whatever else, straightforwardly. In just much in the same way, right, as, you think about a truth-seeking mechanism or a truth commission, there's a relationship there to producing shared accounts of the past, right? And so memory is sort of implicated in the sense of, transitional justice requiring us to at least think about the sort of the stories that are told about the past, right? So the sort of, people talk about the narratives, for example, story, the sort of content of memory or content of shared histories. But I think actually what really what I found more interesting was the way in which memory is it's not just the sort of, the fodder, the sort of, the content as such. It's the rallying cry, right? It's the rationale, it's the justification, but it's also the sort of, at times explicitly the sort of, the optics through which people are justifying these sorts of interventions, right? I mean, it's very hard to think about doing transitional justice and evading that sort of language of, we've got to come to terms with this past, or, dealing with or moving through or working through. And so suddenly you've already seen this sort of weird slippage of, concepts and ideas, not, in any sort of, not defined with any necessary precision or used with any sort of technical purpose, but they've slipped, they're mobile, they've moved across, from a sort of, therapeutic, implicit, loose, common sense understanding of what experiences of atrocity entail to, justifications for mechanisms which are fundamentally political, right? Whether you're talking about a war crimes tribunal or you're talking about a truth commission. And I think that, there's something very interesting in that respect in terms of the way, injunctures to remember, we never again, right? We must prevent these things happening again. All of these things have a relationship with memory that works in I think, really complicated, interesting ways.
And where are you taking your research next?
At the moment, I'm working on a couple of different projects. So as I've been doing a lot of work on genocide education in Cambodia. Obviously, I wrote the book about Cambodia. I've been doing work on a grant called Changing the Story that's led by the University of Leeds and Paul Cook at the University of Leeds. This grant, this project is really interesting because it's trying to build inclusive civil societies with and for young people, and it's particularly interested in arts and education approaches, right? And we've been doing a lot of cool stuff in Cambodia where actually we're engaging former perpetrator communities, right? So former members of the Khmer Rouge, who quite often are very stigmatised, but also are very important in the way the Cambodian state understands reconciliation, and therefore afforded or have been afforded a space, I suppose, within a number of sort of NGO projects or civil society-led projects in terms of including their sort of stories, right, of not just sort of the genocide and the perpetration and commission of the genocide and the guilt of the leadership especially, right, but they're also their experiences of the war afterwards, and how that could be drawn upon and inform these basically civil society-led educational initiatives, right? So we've been doing a lot of work with participatory video, for example, getting students and trainee teachers to make their own films with lower-level perpetrators and see what comes out of that.
What do you hope will come out of that?
Well, we'd hope that the films that we produced would be used or seen by other students. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because when you're working with really contested history, right, and when you're working with what is fundamentally contested memory, in some ways, when you can see positive things happening, right, you can see a sort of rehumanisation of these sort of stigmatised groups, and the lower-level perpetrators were themselves quite often, as we understood or understand them, complex victims, right? Themselves, they might have also lost relatives or might have also, suffered under the Khmer Rouge.
Is there a risk, though, in giving them that kind of platform?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the things we're finding, right? So that's the double-edged sword is that what we can see in these videos sometimes is that actually there's often space at least afforded for them to let's say locate themselves perhaps in ways that other victim constituencies I think would find problematic, right? So even as you can see sort of reconciliation occurring, and I'm very sceptical about that term and the concept and that sort of assumptions about what it entails, in this instance, it's also certainly generating, I think, material that could be provocative, I think, for other people.
What's your own ethical obligation when something like that happens, these kind of unintended consequences?
Well, I think, as a researcher, it's quite interesting because I'm following this, you can't detach yourself from the sort of, the projects and the initiatives that you've set in motion. But I think if I was so concerned to such an extent that, there's any sense of sort of denial or revisionism going on, then that would be a problem. At the moment, really, all we can see is that this is a space in which it's very easy for former Khmer Rouge to paint themselves as victims. And the problem is that at the moment within Cambodia, right, that's fine because that's what the government kind of wants, you know. Yeah. So the ethical question arises as much for the context as it arises sort of for me, right? And so I think what the obligation really is then is just more research. You've got to reflect on that really critically. I think it's really important and compelling in terms of the sort of lessons that we can yield from that.
Yeah. So much ground covered there, Pete. Thank you so much. If law students were listening and wanted to maybe learn a bit more about these connections between human rights and transitional justice and memory, what kind of like starter readings would you recommend for them?
Yeah, I think I was really lucky when I started my PhD to work a bit with Stan Cohen at the LSE, and I might do a misattribution here because it was either Stan himself or Ron Doodite describing Stan's work, but broadly the corpus was interested in why we pay too much attention to some things and why we don't pay enough attention to others, right? And there's a sort of, you know, basic principle for why you go out and do sociology. I think that's really important. It's a really useful way of thinking about not just memory, but transitional justice and human rights as well. So there's a book, States of Denial, that I'd really urge everybody to go out and read. You know, it's a fantastic book. So that would be my top tip. And then anything by my former supervisor, Claire Moon. I'm an acolyte, you know. She's definitely spot on a lot of this stuff. And then Kieran as well, obviously, right? Got to kind of give a shout out to Kieran, I suppose. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.